Modern Africa. Okay, backing it up all the way to the fall. Remember the Berlin Conference? We sat around in groups of like 8, and you guys had to look at your countries and decide which chunks of Africa you wanted as European powers. And remember how that actually happened, and it was called the Berlin Conference? Yeah, so back in 1885, the leaders of Africa meet to decide the borders of their new African colonies. Gradually, as you can see by the maps, the African colonies gained their independence and became the African countries. However, the borders that were drawn by Europe caused some problems that still affect Africa today. So that is what today's lesson is going to be about, is how these borders and European influence led to some of the problems that Africa is having today, as well as some of the hope for Africa's future, which we'll deal with more in class next class. So around the same time as India, you can see the waves of independence. We have independent by 1950, which is all these countries right here. And you'll notice 2 countries here that were never colonized. So they were independent by 1950. And then in the decade afterwards, we've seen some in northern Africa, like Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan. Those countries become independent, and then right after them is Saharan Africa and the rest of northern Africa and western Africa. And that's from 1960 to 1966. So remember, this is during the Cold War. And then in between 1973 and 1978, after the Vietnam War, we got a couple more countries over here gaining some independence. And then these countries, although they were independent, they were under apartheid regimes. So, like South Africa, for instance, was under apartheid regimes. And that's what we are going to look at next, because that also significantly affected how society in certain African countries is run today. So like I said, Europe's colonization of Africa seriously underdeveloped the countries. So they were kept oppressed by African powers because the African powers were basically just using Africa for its resources. So after they exploited these resources without making significant progress, European imperialism further impoverished countries without the significant infrastructure improvements needed to become a modern 20th century country. And that's kind of why these nations are still developing, as opposed to developed first and second world countries. A little vocabulary: infrastructure. You may have seen this word in here before, and I've given you a brief definition, but this is very important for developed countries and developing countries. Infrastructure is the basic structures needed for a society or country to function. So this includes all the roads, bridges, trains, public works, utilities, anything that is basically government-owned stuff to get the people where they need to go, get communication as it needs to be. The internet might be considered infrastructure now. Companies can have infrastructure, but usually we refer to countries' infrastructure. So you'll hear this word in different contexts. The other thing that kept Europe's former colonies oppressed was the slave trade, which started all the way back in the 1400s, as well as the virtual slavery and the illegal slave trade that is still going on in these countries. This, reduced the countryside labor needed to cultivate the crops, and also reduced the labor that needed to develop education even after the countries had gained their independence. So fewer people, they were still kept oppressed by this virtual slave system. Alright, and one of the main modes of oppression was called apartheid. So, as you probably know, apartheid was the system of racial segregation in South Africa that lasted from 1948 to 1994. And it was created to keep economical and political power with the people of English descent and heritage. So unlike segregation and Jim Crow laws in the U.S., apartheid was created so that white people could stay in power even after independence, because they had power under independence and a lot of them had moved there and become very comfortable. So they wanted to keep that economical and political power. It did not come out of slavery, but it similarly came out of oppression, racial oppression, based on race. So you have on your note sheet a long list of these different acts. So take a look at them, and there's a checkpoint question that tells you what coloreds, as they refer to them as, and non-coloreds, or white people, could do under apartheid. So this was very strict. They had to live on a very small percentage of land, and it wasn't very good land. They couldn't marry. Interracial marriages were illegal. Everyone had to be registered by their race, and they had to carry identification based on that registration. This was all, as you can see, from 1936 to the 1950s. These were established, and then they stayed in place until the 1990s, which is crazy. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 required that only concepts that would be used in allowed jobs that were specified for non-white people would be taught. So they were intentionally kept in lower paying positions, and their schools were only allowed to teach them skills that were needed for these low paying jobs. They were not allowed to learn things like law, medicine, politics, education, as in learning how to be a teacher. The engineering, those kinds of things were prohibited. They also legalized racial segregation of public areas, and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1953 made harsher punishments legal for non-whites. So, for instance, the same crime, shoplifting, you could have corporal punishment, which means being hit or beaten based on your crime, and white people would not receive the same punishment. The Native Labor Act of 1953 banned Africans from going on strike, so they couldn't even strike for their labor rights, for higher wages, etc. All right, so the impact of apartheid. Wow, did not know that was going to happen. It forced blacks, first of all, to move to the poor rural areas called the homelands. So these were kind of like slums, except they were much more rural, and this was a very small percentage of the land. So the whites could live in the good land. Blacks were also kept in low-paying jobs, as I stated previously. And they were put in poor schools that couldn't teach them those things based on those laws. And all of this resulted in severe oppression for non-whites in South Africa, which halted progress for the country as a whole. So, apartheid, as you may assume, caused severe violence among the citizens of South Africa for people protesting against apartheid. And it also caused a trade embargo. Countries were so upset with how this South Africa was treating its own people that they refused to trade with South Africa. So that hurt South Africa economically and on a more global level, which also demonstrated to the South Africans in power that this probably needed to end. So the protests, uprising, and violence helped end apartheid. In 1990, Frederick Willem de Klerk, who was president, and he was, as you can probably tell by his name, of Dutch descent, which South Africa was a Dutch colony. He began talks to end apartheid. So he was really the first one to be open to this idea. This was right around the time the Cold War was ending. Things are starting to shift in the more human rights direction, less imperialism, less dominant powers. It was more, how can we all work together in the world? And this is really the time period where globalization started up too, as a worldwide concept that we all needed to work together towards one global goal. So in 1994, Nelson Mandela finally becomes president of South Africa and ends apartheid. So certain laws were changed so that he could become president, and then he officially ended apartheid. And South African society is still feeling the effects of this decades-long system of segregation and oppression. You've probably noticed in our country, we're still feeling the oppression and effects of our racial segregation. this wasn't that long ago for them. This was only 20 years ago. So this is even closer. And they still have a long way to go. Checkpoint number 1. All right. So one of the first things I want to talk about in terms of Africa is the human rights violations. And this is somewhat due to imperialism, also due to the corrupt governments that have been in power in African nations since imperialism. Africa has been home to instances of human rights violations in the 20th and 21st century. The people who have been in power wanted to keep the people not in power out of power. So they abused their power. They kept certain sections of society oppressed due to ethnic differences. That's one of the problems, that these drawn borders that are arbitrarily drawn on the continent, that's one of the problems that arises from that. So human rights violations are now, or human rights are now being ensured much better thanks to supranational organizations of the African Union and the intervention of the United Nations. At multiple instances, the United Nations has sent in the peacekeepers to try to quell violence or save some refugees from countries that were being violently oppressed. The other thing that's helping is that democracy is spreading on the continent. Right now, 13 countries are truly democratic, according to National Geographic, which helps secure human rights for millions, but there is still a very long way to go. One of these human rights violations is known as the Darfur crisis, and you may have heard me talk about it or may have heard of this elsewhere. Darfur was actually an independent kingdom or sultanate in Western Sudan until 1916, when it was integrated with Sudan by the British. So the British said, this little kingdom is going to be part of Sudan now, and they just chunked it off. So the people living in Darfur were independent because they were not like the Sudanese. There were these ethnic differences which caused them to have a different kingdom in the first place. So making them join in with the other kingdom was a little bit problematic. So this conflict began in all really violent seriousness in 2003 when Black Sudanese rebels attacked government property, accusing the government of neglecting Darfur in favor of the Arab population in Sudan. So they felt like their government was favoring the ethnically Arab people rather than the ethnically African people. So because of these ethnic differences between the indigenous Darfurian people and the Sudanese government, Darfur has been in an official state of emergency in terms of a humanitarian emergency since 2003. The other thing that is currently facing Africa right now, the other challenge, is disease. And this is not any disease in particular that, you can't even pinpoint one disease in particular, just like you can't in the United States either. But I'm going to talk about the few most popular. So, because the European imperialism ravaged the continent, it was left economically and politically weak. So they didn't have strong government systems, and they didn't have a lot of resources or wealth of their own to really get involved with the world economy, develop their own industries. It was mostly for resources, which we'll also talk about later. So healthcare systems were not well established because of this, and the poor education system, poverty, and also the tropical environment contributed to this as well. So outbreaks of several deadly diseases have occurred on the continent. The first one I want to talk about is called Ebola, which is a virus carried to humans by monkeys or fruit bats, both of which live in Africa, which is why this occurred in Africa. If you are not in an industrialized country, you have lots of interaction with wildlife, and so it's possible that you could get bit by these things. So the first outbreak was recorded in 1976 in Sudan and Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in those two countries and Uganda, between 2007 and 2012, hundreds of people have been killed by the Ebola virus. And this also led to the isolation of the virus, which led to further research on prevention of the virus. So that was a good thing. But still, in 2014, this has killed over 100 people already in Guinea. The second one, which should not surprise you that we're talking about, is HIV/AIDS, which, as you probably know, is transmitted through bodily fluids. So it's either sexually transmitted or transferred through blood, which can be dirty needles, the blood transfusions, those kinds of things. Scientists aren't really sure how it started, but most agree that it started as an epidemic in southern Africa, which now has turned to a pandemic through this transfer of bodily fluids. It's an autoimmune deficiency syndrome where the body loses the ability to fight disease and infection over time, and that's usually what kills the infected person. Since its discovery, AIDS has caused an estimated 36 million deaths worldwide as of 2012. Obviously, that number will be higher now, but this was the most recent figure I could find. And as of 2012, approximately the same number, 35.3 million, are still living with HIV globally. I expect that both numbers have gone up since then. And so it is considered a pandemic. As you can see by this map, only the countries in white are dead zones to AIDS. So the countries in yellow have less of an outbreak, which this is a kind of an interesting map. But you'll notice that, the darkest colors are where the outbreaks are most common. So in this southern portion of Africa, between 15% and 40% of the population are infected with HIV/AIDS, which is crazy. It is a large area and it's actively spreading too. That's the other characteristics of a pandemic. So as you can see, and as I just mentioned, most people living with HIV at this time live in Africa, though the rate of spreading has slowed, which is good. Checkpoint number 2. So the economy of Africa mostly consists of farming and mining, and farming is definitely the most important activity in Africa. 75% of all workers are farmers, so a huge majority. This is subsistence and commercial. Subsistence means just farming to live for yourself and your community, but commercial means you have tracts and tracts of cornfields, for instance. And many African nations have rich mineral resources, which the map to your right shows you. Oil, copper, diamonds, gold, very expensive, rare resources come from Africa. So they have a rich collection of these resources. But this also means that the African economy is sensitive to the global rise and fall of prices of these commodities. So commodities are anything that has its own kind of market that's separate. So based on supply and demand, copper may be very expensive or copper may be very cheap. So therefore, it's not as economically stable as an industrialized economy that produces a set amount of goods. The other thing that's going on, so that's one of the reasons why Africa is not as economically strong as other parts of the world. It's facing some environmental problems, which also leads to economic problems. So 2/3 of the continent is desert, the Sahara Desert, and it's becoming more dry, arid land. So that is a problem for farming when 75% of your workers are farmers. It's a problem when your farmland goes away. The other thing that's happening is deforestation. So that also means fewer crops. So this also means fewer crops means fewer food. So that creates threats of starvation. However, new scientific technologies are making crops easier to cultivate, higher yield rate, those kinds of things. So that's kind of helping these problems. And the social issues that are facing Africa today, which we'll talk about more in class, African children are often needed at home to work on these farms. So sending children to school is a huge sacrifice economically for these poor families living in Africa. Often schools are overcrowded because they still lack infrastructure, so they don't necessarily have the school buildings that they need to host all these children. But literacy has been spreading since most countries have gained their independence, which is good. But there, again, is still a long way to go. And in terms of terrorism, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I just want to mention it quickly here. Al-Qaeda and affiliates are gaining more support in Africa. Part of that is due to economic reasons. All those things that you guys wrote about in your ECR. In Nigeria, we've talked about Boko Haram almost every day for the last 2 weeks. So you guys are very familiar with the problems in Nigeria and those local issues that have to deal with the social issues of children and developing society, those kinds of things. Somalia is another hotspot for Al-Qaeda related terrorism, which we will also talk more about in class. And here's your last checkpoint.